Welcome to Fairview Cemetery in Cedar Falls. This is the third oldest of the city's municipal cemeteries, although it's only about a decade younger than Greenwood and Hillside. Fairview Cemetery was founded in 1865. And a group of Cedar Falls residents gathered together, created an association, and laid out this cemetery over the summer. First burial here was Marion Bancroft, who had died in 1855, but was moved here in September of 1865. The cemetery was on the outskirts of town, on a hillside that was southwest of the main city. And if you look around, most of the houses built surrounding this cemetery were built in the mid-20th century, in the 1950s or 1960s. So for about almost 80 or 90 years, the cemetery was surrounded by fields. In fact, the earliest picture we have of the mausoleum in the cemetery shows nothing in the background all the way over to College Street, where there's one lone farmhouse that still stands at the corner of 13th and College. The cemetery, the rest of the area grew up as the city grew towards the university on the hill. So as we filled in between the downtown district and the college, this area was built up, and so the cemetery is now in the middle of the city. But originally in the 1860s, it would have been on the outskirts. It was laid out around this center, and so the oldest graves you're going to find are near the flagpole around the center in the sections that face onto the circle in the middle of the cemetery. It's laid out as a Victorian cemetery. The roads are fairly straight, but there are some curves and make it a pleasant place to walk. Big old trees, and particularly this time of year in the fall, it's very attractive. Fairview contains a lot of interesting Victorian monuments made of granite and marble and showing the styles that were popular in this period. One of the most common is an obelisk, and we see the Babcock obelisk, which is the tallest monument in the cemetery, made of granite behind me. An obelisk is originally from Egypt, but the Romans and the Greeks liked them so much that they actually stole a lot of them from Egypt. The obelisk you see behind me, which is made out of granite, is the Babcock lot, and it's fairly typical of what becomes known as the Lawn Park Cemetery, and that is, and you'll see this common throughout Fairview, families buy a family lot where they can inter their relatives, but there's only one large family monument. There's one large monument that commemorates the family, and then around it you'll see smaller individual headstones or footstones showing where the individual graves are, but those are much more discreet. So you have one large family monument surrounded by smaller monuments marking the individual graves of that family. This is the monument of John Cameron, who was one of the first settlers in Cedar Falls in the pioneer days. From 1853 to 1857, he ran a ferry across the Cedar River, roughly where the First Street Bridge is, and that was before any bridges were built. His ferry came to an end when the first wood bridge was built, although it turned out to be not a very good bridge in 1857. But until then, if you wanted to get across the Cedar River, you would take John Cameron's ferry. James and Caroline Round sent two of their sons to the Civil War in 1861 at the age of 18. He enlisted in the 1st Iowa Battalion. Both he and his brother went down south and fought in Mississippi. George Round in particular became ill, and we know that actually we lost more soldiers during the Civil War to illness than we did to wounds and in battle. We know a little bit about his story because it was reported in the newspaper, and oddly enough, one of his letters appeared on eBay not too long ago, and it tells us a little bit of the story about how he was feeling. So he wrote this letter in Iuka, Mississippi, which is in the northeastern corner of Mississippi, to his parents on October 11th. He wrote, "Dear parents, I take this opportunity to scribble you a few lines to let you know that I am still living, but I've been very sick for the last 2 months with the diarrhea and have written little to anyone. So you can apologize for me if you hear any complaints of my silence. My strength is gone and I must close. Sam was at Corinth, sick with the diarrhea, but I think he'd be better. I am gaining slowly and I will be well in a few days. Give my respects to all my friends." He wrote this and sent it to his father, James Round, and it was assigned to his father that he was not feeling very well, and indeed he was very, very sick. So what his dad, James, did was to go down and get him and brought him back from the hospital there and got him as far as Dubuque. Sadly, when he got to Dubuque, he was so ill that they couldn't come any further, and he died there. His body was brought back and buried here under this marker, which is one of the older veterans' headstones. You'll see older veterans' headstones have a kind of military shield on them. This headstone, we think, dates from about 1900, when the family would have ordered it, and is unique in this family lot. His cousin, who's mentioned there, Sam Round, we'll see his grave later. He did survive and come back to build a house on South Main that we can still see. His brother also survived, although he was badly wounded at Vicksburg, lost a few fingers, and left the Army. Here along the main road, you have the two most significant people in the history of Cedar Falls, or at least its founding. The first of these is Peter Melendi, who we now have an award for our representative citizens named after, for who contribute the most to the city. And it's hard to say that anybody could have beaten Peter Melendi for that particular phrase. Melendi is one of the pioneers. He comes here before the Civil War and is a mover and shaker. He really promotes the town. Eventually he writes a book about the history of Cedar Falls, published in 1893, about 50 years after the city is founded and the first pioneers get here. Melendi is responsible for helping convince the legislature to build an orphanage here, and then to move that orphanage and build a new building on the hill, which becomes the kernel of the normal school, today's University of Northern Iowa. He's also involved in, when that orphanage runs out of orphans by the middle of the 1870s, in having that building reallocated and used for the state's normal school. Normal school is a teacher's training college, and so Melendi is the one who helps bring that here and have the state use the former orphanage building to house that college, which eventually expands into the University of Northern Iowa. Next to him is buried Homer Surley, who is the most important man probably in the history of the University of Northern Iowa. Homer Surley becomes president of the college in 1886. He remains president until 1928, so he's the longest president in the college's history and the most important. When he arrives, there are only 2 buildings and a handful of faculty members. When he retires at the end of the 1920s, virtually all the old buildings that we know today have been erected, and it's turned into a major college. Surley is the one who begins in the old president's house and moves into the new president's house. He's the one who makes sure that the library gets built at the turn of the century. That library is now Surley Hall, which is named for him. As well as Surley Hall, there's also a boulevard named for him and a park, so he's a fairly important figure in our history. This is the Sessions tombstone. It commemorates 2 generations of the Sessions family. William and Elmira Sessions were the pioneers who came here originally with their son Fitzroy. William is a veteran of the Mexican-American War, and his wife, Elmira, was one of the founders of the Civil War Soldiers' Aid Society, which women put together to help the soldiers during the Civil War. They raised money, held fundraisers and dances, and stitched together uniforms and sent care packages to the soldiers. One of these soldiers was Fitzroy Sessions, who fought for the first couple years of the Civil War. Fitzroy then came back and was deputy marshal of Black Hawk County for a time. He seems to have had something of a hair-trigger temper. Eventually his mind gave way and he ended up in the hospital in Independence, which is where he died. This is the Jones Monument, which is another one of the zinc monuments in the cemetery. It has some wonderful symbolism, including on the side here some cut wheat, which symbolizes the harvest of life. When you see the wheat that has been cut and bundled, that symbolizes that it's been harvested, that we've gone to heaven. On it, you'll also see a sickle, which would symbolize death. What's most interesting about this isn't so much the symbolism as it is the epitaph, which is one of the most interesting epitaphs I've ever seen. On the side here, it reads, "Let us try to make the world better for having lived in it. Justice demands the same rights for women as for men." So it's a suffrage epitaph. What we certainly can conclude from that was that Ava Jones was a suffragist, and presumably, since her Her husband survived her and allowed this on the monument. He must have supported women's suffrage as well. Neither of them lived to see it. She died 4 years before women were allowed the right to vote. It's likely this monument was put up when their daughter died, roughly in the 1880s or perhaps 1890s. Charles Fullerton taught at the University of Northern Iowa, then the State Teachers College, for almost 50 years. For 48 years he was in the classroom there. He's most remembered today for music education. He tried to bring a higher quality of music education to rural schools, particularly one-room schools that didn't have the resources or specially trained teachers. And he did this by using a new technology called records. He would use recordings and records to help students learn from the best singers that there were. His plan was called the Fullerton Choir Plan and was the most important thing to happen to music education probably in the 20th century. The Victorian period in the 19th century was sort of obsessed with death. They loved beautiful monuments, but by the 20th century that interest sort of changed and people were less interested in visiting cemeteries and were less inclined to have elaborate funerals and go into periods of mourning. The 20th century tries to keep death at something of an arm's length, and so the styles of the cemeteries that are created in the 19th century reflect, or in the 20th century reflect that. This is a good example of that sort of section. It's called a Memorial Park section because all the markers are flat and set into the ground. So if you drive by or look, it looks just like a lawn or a park. You wouldn't necessarily know that people are buried there until you get on top of it. And this is, in a sense, a 20th century expression of cemeteries. The idea that we don't really particularly want to engage very much with death. So today it seems very odd that you'd go for a walk in a cemetery, whereas in the Victorian period, people went for picnics and walks and even dates through cemeteries to look at the monuments and enjoy the landscape. So this is a reflection of the 20th century. Among the people buried in here is Joe Eiler, who is the sexton for Cedar Falls Cemeteries from the 1930s into the late 60s. He's the first person that starts records. So the records of this cemetery and of Greenwood Cemetery only really go back to the 1930s when he began platting out the cemetery and keeping a note file in cards showing who was buried where. So before the 1930s, there are no records of burials here. You can probably get them from death certificates and perhaps from surviving headstones, but the cemetery themselves, their record starts in the mid-1930s. This is the grave of Howard Vanderbeek, who died about 3 years ago. He lived a long time, but the most famous thing he did was on June 6, 1944. He was in charge of a small boat called an LCC, or Landing Control Craft. He and two other boats were responsible for coordinating the landing on Utah Beach in Normandy on D-Day. The other two LCCs were sunk, so by the middle of the battle and the landing, he was the only control ship left, which meant that his ship was responsible for coordinating the landing on Utah Beach on D-Day. He kept the flag from that day that had flown over that boat, and we used it about 10 years or 15 years ago when we had a World War II exhibit. The centerpiece of that exhibit was Howard's flag from the LCC. It was so full of damage and holes and burn marks from the battle. It was one of the most alive artifacts I've ever seen, and people were very impressed to see it. After he died, it was put up at auction, and it sold for over $500,000. The third president of UNI buried here is Malcolm Price, who was president from 1940 to 1950 during the Second World War. He had served in the machine gun battalion during the First World War. While he was president of UNI, much of the campus was devoted to supporting the war effort, including a battalion of Waves who lived and were trained at the campus. He retired in 1950, and for the next 13 years was a professor in the Psychology and Ed Foundations Department before retiring in 1963. For many years, the university's lab school was named in his honor. Today, he's almost as well known for his daughter, the writer Nancy Price, who wrote the famous book turned into a film called Sleeping with the Enemy. In time, Nancy will join him and her mother in this lot. Her tombstone is already here with the epitaph, "When we turn homeward." Laroy and Nancy Redfern were two of the most significant individuals in Cedar Falls during the late 20th century. Laroy was a lawyer. Both of them did a lot of service and devoted a lot of their time to helping the community. I just wanted to talk a little bit about Nancy's achievements in the area of historic preservation. It is due to her efforts that the ice house was preserved and turned into a museum, and she lived long enough to see it flooded during the floods and rebuilt afterwards in its current condition as a state-of-the-art raised museum that hopefully will avoid the floods in the future. Ruth Wilcox was a teacher who graduated from Iowa State Teachers College. She taught in rural schools and also in Winterset, in Waterloo, and Toddville before retiring. In her retirement, she enjoyed working at the little one-room schoolhouse that the Cedar Falls Historical Society owns down by the river. She would work in the summer programs where kids would experience what it was like to go to school in a one-room schoolhouse 100 years ago. She was so devoted to that program that she asked for that to be remembered on her tombstone. So when we look at her tombstone today, we see an etching of the Little Red Schoolhouse downtown. Her husband was a carpenter, and as a memorial to his late wife, he built the wooden door that we still use to open the schoolhouse. Leland Sage taught at University of Northern Iowa from 1932 to 1986, a total of 54 years, which seems to have been a record for the length of service as teaching at UNI. He was a historian of Iowa who wrote his first book on Iowa's famous senator, William B. Allison, and then wrote an even more popular book called The History of Iowa in 1974. Bashir Najim was a geographer at University of Northern Iowa. If we look at his headstone, we'll note that his epitaph reads, "I'm a Palestinian," indicating his pride in his national origin and making a political statement. What I think it also symbolizes is how the university has brought in so much diversity and so many interesting people to Cedar Falls. So when we walk around here, we see epitaphs and memorials to people from all over the world, all thanks to the university bringing them in to teach here. Some distance from the main cemetery, there are two 19th century markers together on this slight knoll over by this tree. They're Weller headstones. They're here since around the beginning of the cemetery, but presumably they were a family lot or maybe from a farming family, but they're not connected to the rest of the cemetery. Although, given the expansion of the plans for the cemetery, they soon will be surrounded. But here they are for people that are nowhere to look for them, almost buried now under the grass. Captain Jack Fuller served in a field artillery unit in the Second World War. He was killed in Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. The house he grew up in still stands in Cedar Falls. It's on the northeast corner of 17th and College Streets. This monument is over the grave of Robert Lowell Brown's parents. Robert Brown never came back from World War II, so this serves as a cenotaph or memorial to someone who doesn't have a grave. He was a pilot in the Second World War. On February 15th, 1943, he left to fly over Italy and was lost over Naples. His parents wanted to make sure that he was remembered, so they put up this monument to commemorate his life. His body was never recovered. He is also remembered in the North African American Cemetery in Tunisia on the memorial wall of the missing there. We recently came across a snapshot taken of Robert Brown in his pilot's uniform as he was about to leave for that last flight. Near the end of the Civil War, an orphanage was opened in downtown Cedar Falls to provide a home for the children who had been left fatherless by the Civil War. There was a series of these orphanages built throughout Iowa, and eventually the orphanage received its own building on a hill a few miles south of town. That orphanage, which opened in 1869, eventually became the kernel of what is now the University of Northern Iowa, its original building. A number of orphans died while they were living at the orphanage, most of them at the orphanage downtown, in a measles epidemic in 1866. Those children are buried here under this mound, under a pink granite obelisk that was erected for them in 1886. In 1910, Frank Cotton built a theater downtown at the corner of First and Main Street. The theater was designed to be a home for traveling companies of actors who would put on plays and shows. This was very popular for a couple of years, but the days of traveling showmen was beginning to end, and by 1913, 3 years after the theater had opened, he was already having trouble with it, and so he sold it. At that point, it was renamed the Regent Theater and continued to welcome acting companies as they passed through town. By the end of that decade, it had already been turned into a movie theater, and that it remained for many years. In recent years, the theater has been restored as the Oster Regent Theater and is now one of the landmarks downtown for the community. It is recognized on the National Register of Historic Places. David Sands Wrights was one of the 4 original faculty members at what would become the University of Northern Iowa, but what was then the State Normal Teachers College. Wright began there in 1876 when it opened. For a while he taught English and then shifted in 1881 to math. Eventually he became in charge of religious studies. At the 50th anniversary of the university, he wrote a memoir about its history called 50 Years at the Teachers College. He retired soon after, and in his honor, Wright Hall was named for him. The granite Pixley Monument has some beautiful symbolism on it. It shows us the heavenly city. Above it, you see the crown of salvation and the light behind it. It's always been interesting to me that the way we picture the heavenly city is also the way we would have pictured Jerusalem or Bethlehem about 100 years ago. And in that, it tends to look a little bit like an Islamic city with minarets and domes, but that is supposed to represent heaven. The Williams Monument is a really nice example of a tree-shaped memorial. By the end of the 1800s, people were looking for monuments that blended in with the natural scenery in cemeteries. So ones that were made out of stone but looked like old tree branches and old tree trunks became very popular. The Williams one is a really wonderful example of that. If you look at top, you'll see a broken branch that says Frankie, which probably means that Frank was a son who did not live long enough to have children, so his branch did not branch out or flower. You'll also see that Catherine, their daughter, is noted below where the bark has been peeled back. There are other symbols like ferns at the bottom and a scroll. But what's particularly interesting about the Williams plot is that even the individual headstones look like logs. So if we look at the markers for the individual Williams graves, we see a set of logs, some of which have symbolism on themselves that represent that individual. So on one marker we see a Masonic symbol showing the compass there and the Holy Bible. On another, on Catherine's headstones, we see an easel with paintbrushes, indicating that she must have been an artist. Charles Fields and his brother arrived here around the time of the Civil War. They were bankers, and they were famous for the cattle that they raised on their farm a little bit southwest of town. Today they're best remembered for the barn that they built that stood for many years along University Avenue as you headed towards Dyke. Sadly, the barn fell into ruin and was torn down about 10 or 15 years ago now. Their bank failed during the 1890s, and eventually the other brother left town, but Charles remained here and is buried here with his children. If you look at the headstones of his children, you'll see that many of them died very young. The Dayton Mausoleum is the only family mausoleum in Cedar Falls. It was built in 1899 when Martin Dayton died. Martin had been the president of the Cedar Falls Mills Company, which ran a number of the mills along the mill race downtown. That was the center of the Cedar Falls economy in the 1800s. When he died, his wife built this mausoleum, which now houses her remains as well as their son Gaylord and their daughter-in-law, who was buried here, the last one to be buried here in the 1950s. When Martin died, Sarah looked for ways to try to commemorate him in Cedar Falls. Early in the 20th century, she donated land for the city library. With money that they got from Andrew Carnegie, they built the Dayton Carnegie Library, which remained Cedar Falls Library until early in this century. That land was donated by her and still is the place where the library stands today. Edward Townsend was a Civil War veteran. He came to Cedar Falls and founded a bank with a partner named Knapp. Together, they married two sisters and lived in a home that they built at the corner of 3rd and Clay. Today, that is the Cedar Falls Women's Club, so it's a home that everybody knows. In 1878, he built his second house, this time at 11th and Washington. That today is also a landmark, the beautiful Victorian mansion that still stands there. He served as our city's mayor and also as an important businessman in the community. James Hearst is one of Iowa's best-known poets. He was born at Maplehurst, a farm that was just a little bit west of town. At the age of 19, in the spring, he dove into the Cedar River in a good swimming place that had changed in the winter and hit his head in a bad way. At that point, he broke his neck and became a paraplegic for the rest of his life. He continued to farm and to write poetry for the next 60-some years. When he died, his widow willed their home to the city, and it has become since the Hearst Center for the Arts. Today, his poetry is still read and edited, and members of the English department, like Scott Kowalty and Jim O'Loughlin, are still finding ways to work with his poetry, either to set it to music, to find poems that have not been published and put them in print. And there is a monument to him in front of his former home, which is now the Art Center. This is the lot that belongs to the Western Home, one of the oldest retirement communities in Cedar Falls. There are currently 43 residents of the Western Home who were buried here when they died. They're buried in the order that they died in, mainly in the 1920s and 1930s, although the earliest grave is 1914 and the most recent one is 1978. Marion Sawyer was the first burial in Fairview Cemetery. Although she died in 1855, 10 years later she was dug up and reburied here in September 1865, the first grave within the cemetery. She's part of this larger Sawyer family that included merchant Moses Sawyer, and their home today on 12th Street is still a city landmark. In 1941, Don Medicus and Bob Home were co-captains of the Cedar Falls football team at the high school. The following year, they both went into the Army. Don received training as a combat medic and as a paratrooper. Later that year, he went into France behind the D-Day invasion and fought at Hell's Corner in 1944 in June. He became part of Operation Market Garden, which was an assault by paratroopers into Holland. That invasion did not go well, and on October 5th, 1944, Don Medicus was going ahead of the American lines to bring back wounded soldiers when he was killed in front of the lines. His bravery was such that he was awarded the Silver Star and remembered here in town. Ironically, the same day in France, Robert Home also went in front of our lines to bring back a wounded soldier and was killed. So we have a remarkable coincidence that on October 5th, 1944, both co-captains of the 1941 football team at Cedar Falls High School were killed doing the same thing in Europe, going in front of the lines to bring back wounded soldiers. After the war, both of them were brought back home to Cedar Falls. Don Medicus to be buried here in Fairview in his family plot, and Robert Home to be buried in Greenwood Cemetery. So this is the main road into the cemetery. On either side, you'll find some of the most important people in Cedar Falls history. You'll find the Rounds, you'll find the Sessions, you'll find Homer Searley, Peter Melendi, Charles Fullerton, the Bryants. It's a pretty elite area, and these lots must have been sold early to families who wanted to get the best places in the cemetery.